Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for that very generous and interesting observation on me. So, good afternoon. Welcome all you to this afternoon session. Today, we are going to be having a conversation with Narayani Basu on her very recent book titled A Man for All Seasons. So, if I talk very briefly about the content of this book, it's the content is very much familiar to Malayalis or the people who are living in Kerala, who is none other than K M Panikkar, right? Even though he is massively popular or famous nationally and internationally, I am slightly skeptical about the fact that he was not known much. I don't know if I'm wrong, you can correct me, but he's not that much known in Kerala. But in that sense, Narayani Basu has done a very interesting thing by filling this gap, filling this very problematic academic vacuum. So I think this book, interestingly, surgically presents this man, his life, his career, and his turbulent life as a diplomat, strategist, writer, academic, vice chancellor, and lots more, right? And that's why the title is, I think, though the title is A Man for All Seasons, I think one famous journalist, Ishwar Datta, has proposed a very interesting title on this man, that is An Impossible Man, right? So that's also is equally important. Now I would like to invite Narayani to this conversation. So, it's very customary to get some interesting ideas on the author, right? So would you mind reflecting on yourself for some time?
First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you for that very kind introduction. When I began researching, my first biography was on VP Menon, who was Sardar Patel's right-hand man in the Ministry of States. And he was the man who helped Sardar Patel integrate 565 princely states into the modern Union of India. At the time, I was just coming out of a brief stint at being a foreign policy analyst. And while I was working as a foreign policy analyst, I used to specialize in Chinese foreign policy at the time. And then I had read about K M Panikkar's memoir in China. I had picked it up, I had read it. So I knew who he was in terms of being our ambassador, possibly during the most controversial stint of his public career in China. When I was researching VP Menon, a few years later, I come across K M Panikkar again in the archives in a very different role as the secretary to the Chamber of Princes in the 1930s. And that got me thinking, actually. I was just wondering, and it happens, I mean, as a fellow academic, you'd know, you sort of go down these rabbit holes of research where you're just trying to ask yourself the questions of how this person who was secretary to the Chamber of Princes, how did he become our ambassador to China? Where did he come from? Where did he grow up? What led him to this very unconventional career path that he chose? So once the biography on VP Menon was finished, I began researching K M Panikkar, and I discovered that, actually speaking, along with being secretary to the Chamber of Princes, he was so much more. He was a journalist. He was the founding editor of the Hindustan Times. He was a lawyer by training. He was a professor of history at Aligarh Muslim University. He was a writer and a poet in Malayalam, and a very prolific one at that. He was a translator. He used to translate Greek plays into Malayalam. He was a member of the States Reorganization Commission. He served 3 princely states, Kashmir, Patiala, and Bikaner. He was so many, many things that, this is why I called it A Man for All Seasons, because truly speaking, his friend, the journalist Ishwara Datta, was right when he said he was one of India. Panikkar was one of India's impossible men, because even after I finished writing a biography that spans some 700 pages, I still found it hard to sort of buttonhole him into one clear compartment or category, because this was a man who had done so much, not only in colonial India, but also in post-colonial India, in the first 2 decades of our existence as a post-colonial nation. So it fascinated me, and the result was this book. The result was this book.
Try and get you. Sorry?
Can you hear me? I said the result.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's fine, that's fine. So you understood the range of his interventions, right? And to give you a very popular joke, it's an academic circle. When the VC post for the Kerala University was raised, so they were considering very many important names. So the name of Panikkar also came. At that time, one of the very popular persons made a very interesting comment. He seems to be not much popular among Malayalis, among Keralites, right? And you know that in Kerala, even remember that we had a very popular Dalit scholar who was also considered for the VCship of Kerala University. He was also, I don't exactly remember the name, but the point is that, see how irresponsibly people looking at these kind of people. So he was a towering figure, donning so many roles, right? So you know that if you look at this, for the first part of the book, Narayani is detailing the formative days of this person, his childhood, his grandmother who was very caring, his maternal uncle who is slightly demanding, very, very difficult presence. And the Kerala of the time is very, very, turbulent. The idea of reformation, the idea of Renaissance coming. He makes a reference about women at that time. As far as women are concerned, they just need to know 2 things. Way into the vegetable market and way back to the, I think Narayani is mentioning that. So from that, a very typical, traditional, conventional Kerala scenario is slowly changing into a very progressive space. So his formative period is influenced by all of these factors. His stay in Trivandrum, the stay with his brother, right? And the people he was meeting with, the literary figures, the scholars, cultural activities. So in a way, it was a very, very interesting formative period for this person. How do you look at that, developing this person in his later life? Does it have any role there?
I just also like to start, because you've covered such a wide swathe. I think I'd just like to start by saying I don't necessarily know whether Malayalis in total have forgotten K M Panikkar. I feel national memory, however, has moved on, and national memory is such a fickle thing, right? Like you can never tell who it will remember and who it will resurrect. I think one of the reasons I wrote this, and one of the things that kept coming up in my research, this is just before I move into talking about his formative years, which you mentioned. I think one of the things that I found was people remember K M Panikkar in parts. So if you are a lawyer, you remember his contributions to constitutional reform. If you are a foreign policy Mandarin, you remember his time as our ambassador in China, in Egypt, and France. If you are in politics at all, you remember his time with the States Reorganization Commission. So we remember Panikkar in parts. There was never one book, and this is despite the huge amount of writing that he did, that brought together any kind of portrait on Panikkar. I don't pretend to say my book is a comprehensive, definitive book, because I don't like using those words. But yeah, there was no single book that I could pick up to understand who this man was, which is why I wrote this. And definitely his formative years plays a very central role in the man he grows up to be. I think, all our formative years go to play a huge role in who we eventually become. So K M Panikkar essentially grows up in Kuttanad. And he is a very privileged boy. Comes from a very wealthy family. There is no dearth of access to education or privilege in his life. His home is dominated, his life rather, is dominated by his grandmother, whom he loves. They have a very sweet relationship. It's one that's based on a lot of indulgence. She is sort of his partner in crime in a lot of ways, because he's not at all a studious child, right? In fact, his tutor used to sort of tie him up in the sunshine for mistakes that he made and leave him there to reflect on his mistakes. And once the tutor had gone, his grandmother would sneak out and sort of untie him and let him play until the tutor was coming back. So they had a very close, very lovely relationship. There is a sense of real respect for his mother. She features very heavily as a stern, intelligent, very disciplinarian woman. It's from her that he picks up stories of Malayalam legends. He picks up stories of the scriptures. Those are all things that he learns from his mother. His mother's brother, his uncle, is somebody who terrifies him a lot. He features a lot in Panikkar's early years as this sort of domestic tyrant who scares him. And one of the things that I found really lovely about the early years of his life was he undertakes this journey at some point from Kuttanad to Trivandrum. His family is sending him to Trivandrum to continue his schooling there. And he will be living with his brother and his uncle, his younger uncle there. And in his memoirs, he's left behind such a wonderfully lush description of the backwaters that their boat went through. I had to sort of incorporate some of that in the early chapters. If anyone picks up this book and reads the first chapters, there's this really vivid description of what the backwaters were like at the time. Nearly all of it has come from Panikkar's memoir. He was so proud. In those days, it was Travancore. It was not modern Kerala, it was Travancore. And he was always very proud to be a Travancorean. It was a journey that he would never really make again in that kind of slowness and that kind of time that boat journey took. But the fact is, when you read his memoir, and this is a memoir that's written in 1955, right? He's a grown man. A lot of his career is behind him, but he still remembers that journey that he made with such vivid detail that I felt that it was really necessary to bring in that as a sort of living memory that he had of Kerala. And the region that also went on to feature so heavily in his Malayalam fiction, in his poetry, that landscape stayed with him. I thought that was a very lovely, lovely thing about Panikkar, the boy who eventually grew into a man. His schooling in Trivandrum comes at a time when, it's the early 1900s, the Swadeshi movement has happened in one part of the country. His uncle runs a very tight ship at home. So it seems like all his uncles were very stern men. But this particular uncle has a very intellectually open household, right? He is very involved with local political discussions. And you have, the main intellectuals of the day, the journalists, leading lawyers, everyone's dropping in to have a conversation. And Panikkar and his brother are allowed to sit in on these conversations. It's the first time that Panikkar is engaging with an idea that there's a world beyond Kuttanad, right? He obviously can't make too much sense of it yet, but it's his first introduction to a world beyond home. He's not a very studious boy, as I said. He continues to fail very spectacularly in science and mathematics. There's a point at which he tries to commit suicide also because he's so aware that he's letting his family down and people in the family are whispering behind his back about him. And they're all wondering what's going to happen with this boy. So it leaves him with a sense of real inadequacy, somehow. And I think that inadequacy comes out when he's in college. So he goes to the University of Oxford. He goes in 1914. The First World War has not yet broken out. So he arrives maybe a couple of months before war is declared. And, the first thing that he realizes is how out of his depth he is again. Because he's now meeting young men at Oxford who have read books that he's never read. They are having conversations about home rule. They're having conversations about where India stands in the empire. These are all questions he's never thought of. He's never even reflected on. And there's this wonderfully human moment where he goes back to his brother who is studying to be a doctor in Edinburgh. And he goes back to his brother and he says, these guys know so much more than I do. Please, will you lend me some money because I want to buy books and I want to know as much as they do. I want to be able to contribute to discussions. And it's the beginning of a tendency that will stay with him throughout his life. So throughout his life, when you see the adult Panikkar being unable to understand a problem or being unable or simply not knowing enough, he will never not pretend that he knows. He will always go back and read more. Another example that I can give, if I may, is in the 1920s, when he is in Europe and he's traveling, as many privileged young men had the ability to do in those days. He's first in London to train for the bar. From there, he goes to Paris and Berlin. And Paris, in those days, and this was honestly one of my favorite chapters in the book to write, because Paris in those days was this glittering hub of, you had cabaret dances, you could see Ernest Hemingway in cafes, but you also had the seamier side, which is that the city was filled with a lot of migrants. There were people from all parts of the empire, from regions that we know now today as Vietnam, Laos, etc., but in those days was Indochina. You had people coming in from Shanghai, you had people coming in from all over the world. And it opens Panikkar's eyes to the fact that not only is the world changing hugely, especially in the aftermath of the First World War, but he has to figure out that India is also on a canvas that is constantly shifting. It's not just about the national movement, but it's also about the national movement against a huge canvas, a global canvas. And he realizes he doesn't know enough about it. So in Paris, he goes to the library at the Sorbonne and he begins reading because he doesn't know enough about Southeast Asia as a region. He doesn't understand India's role in that region. And he wants to know how India can contribute to Southeast Asian regionalism, in a sense. That word wasn't around in those days, but it was the first beginnings of Panikkar's attempts to understand. So it's a trait that stays with him, right? From boyhood to young manhood and onwards. So in that sense, I think the experiences that he had early on very much contributed to the man and the thinker that he became.
Okay. Now before we move on to slightly problematic and controversial ideas of this person, I would just like to make a mention of the way Narayani was writing this book, right? Though he said that he cannot say that this book is the definitive or the most authentic text on K M Panikkar, but I would like to make a minor mention on the way she has written this book. I got this book just 1 week back, and this has almost about 750 pages plus another 30 references and all, right? So it's a very mammoth or monumental kind of a text, but I could read within a period of 3 to 4, 5 days, right? It's very, very readable, right? Normally, when you read the so-called very authentic histories, right? The so-called trained historians, right? Very often you can move more than 10 to 15 pages, but it's very easily readable with pertinently scintillating, colorful snippets from the lives of this person. Especially if I remember a particular scene where she was talking about the final point of this person's life, during the fag end of his life, he makes a visit to Tayyabji, the ambassador of Germany. So they were having some nice time, and toward the end of the conversation, he said, "You are very fit, you are very strong, and you're going to have a very healthy time and all. The next day, he gets a huge stroke. So the writing, the history becomes more, hooking, more, touching you. So in that sense, moreover, she was referring to the journey of this person from his birthland to Trivandrum. She was giving a very, very panoramic, visuals of the journey. So in a way, I found it was more of, more than history, it's becoming more close to the fiction. So what is the technique of writing history in a touching format? That's I'm very, very interested. You have a special hand for writing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear that, because for me, history is a story. I was taught in school that it was this endless roster of names and dates and events, and that was incredibly boring. But I had in class 12, I had a history teacher who was so good. And she told history as a story. I didn't have to mug up anything. I didn't have to learn anything by rote because I remembered. More importantly, I think the way she told it sort of made me realize for the first time that history was about people. It's about the little things. It's about human nature, essentially. So much of what we consider history, we look back at the big battles and we look back at the major decisions that states may take, etc. It's driven by human nature. It's driven by ego clashes. It's driven by rivalries. It's driven by sometimes by broken hearts. It's driven by really things that, sure, you may read in fiction, but actually speaking, that's what real people do. You may do one small nameless act that can trigger a chain reaction of events that become bigger and bigger and bigger until it's a revolution, right? For me, that's what history is. And that's how I remember my class 12 teacher teaching it to me as. And that's how I wanted to write it as, because for me, it made a lot of sense.
It's not about methodological rigor.
I don't like this whole great man narrative that people have, of putting historical figures, whether they're political leaders or whether they're the diplomats and bureaucrats that I write about, on any kind of pedestal. These are all men who had many virtues, but they also had many flaws. And I don't think that when you're writing a biography, and I primarily do write biographies, I think when you're writing about biographies, I think you shouldn't forget that human nature is at the heart of telling a good biography. And if Panikkar's life, which is as unconventional and as completely dense intellectually as it was, keeps you reading till the last page, then I think that I have done a good job. So thank you. That really did mean a lot.
Okay, now to a very interesting area, right? We know that this book, while presenting K M Panikkar, he specifically mentions about the diverse relations he had with various parts of the world. She particularly mentions he's interested in engaging relationship with women with intelligence, right? Something like that. Women were more intelligent. He was always having an eye for very intelligent, very sensible, not of course very beautiful, but and he also makes mention of his own wife coming to know about that. But I was really, I was watching that she was never judgmental. Narayani was never judgmental on the reaction. She was never feministic, attaching, these kind of relations, a bureaucrat, top statesman having unnecessary relations with women and things like that. So when people talk about Panikkar, this facet of his personality always drops in. So how do you look at this idea of having more relations? Maybe it's slightly problematic when you think in terms of traditional Indian morality and things like that. How do you look at it? You are very non-judgmental. You are watching it as an impassionate, non-judgmental viewer of what is evolving out, what is emerging out of the relations and all. So would it be, I think, it's in a way is sensitizing this person intellectually also. It's not just about the relation. It's more intellectual in that sense.
No, I mean, honestly, I think the only person who had the right to sit in judgment was his wife. But I, as his biographer, am nobody to sit in judgment on
You have the
him.
data.
But yes, I do make it a point. Again, like I said, I don't really believe in sanitizing or whitewashing what I'm saying. Panikkar definitely had an eye for the ladies. When he is...
Especially at the power center.
especially with women who were very strong-minded, very intellectually driven. He liked that meeting of the minds. I mean, among other things, but he liked that intellectual meeting of the minds. In the 1920s, when he is traveling across Europe, he is in Paris when he encounters a woman, a lawyer called Juliette Villiers. And Juliette is at the top of her professional game at that point. She herself is a very fierce feminist. She is leading the bar in her day and in her time. And these two immediately strike up a very close relationship. And it's obviously a relationship that Panikkar holds dear to him. It's brief. It doesn't last beyond the time when he is in Paris. There is a point where his wife certainly finds out about this affair. It causes immense strain in their marriage. What was interesting to me was the paradoxes that this contains, right? Because you can easily be judgmental about the fact that he is having an extramarital affair. You can also be judgmental about the fact, and I have called it chauvinistic because I did find it to be so, the fact that when he was much younger and he was writing in the early 1920s, this was before he had gone to Europe, he was essentially writing about the role of women and how he felt that women should be educated, but not so much that it disturbs the functioning of family life, right? That, of course, that is chauvinistic. I have said it's chauvinistic because it's really nothing else. But what is paradoxical is that this man goes on to, not only after he gets married, have 4 daughters, but he treats his daughters as immense intellectual equals as well. So his eldest daughter is very much involved in sort of, helping him, say, translate a play, helping him figure out where he was stuck in a plot when he was writing a particular Malayalam story. He would speak to his eldest daughter, Parvati, and sort of ask her for her advice. His youngest daughter, Devaki, was trained in the classics. She and he could have fluent conversations in Sanskrit. It's also Devaki who falls in love with M. N. Govindan Nair, who was a rising Communist Party leader at the time. And she falls in love with him at a time when Panikkar is deeply embroiled in China. He is being seen globally as a communist. He is being seen as somebody who is being rightly seen as somebody who has made a grave error in China. Now, to have your youngest daughter in love with a communist leader is not great optics. Devaki also comes out to China at that point where Panikkar and his wife are, and Devaki reports on the activities of the Communist Party for newspapers in India. At no point do you see Panikkar, he's obviously taken aback, he's obviously considerably startled, but at no point does he tell Devaki, you cannot do this, right? If you believe in these principles, they are yours to believe in, right? So there's also paradox to be contained in that, which is why, again, I point out to the complexity of human nature, because you can be chauvinist, but you can also treat your daughters not only as intellectual equals, but women with their own minds and with their own beliefs. So there was that paradox in his personal life as well.
That's very interesting. Look at it, things is very non-judgmental format. Now, as I told you, it's a definitive or very comprehensive analysis on this life of person, his career and things like that. But along with, if you read it closely, you also find some people emerging very, very meaningfully. For example, you have ideas on Nehru, right? You get the picture of Nehru emerging very seriously, the picture of Sardar Panikkar, the visual of Mao Zedong. So, though it is apparently a text on, Panikkar, it's also becoming a very interesting treatise on some of the towering individuals of Indian and world political scenario. Especially, I was talking to her that I found the conversation between Nehru and Panikkar was very, very intellectually exciting. At some time, I feel Nehru is stopped. Nehru's arguments were more, loaded and reflective and philosophical. But in a kind of, it's a sort of a conversation of equal. So I would like you to reflect how, and Gandhi is coming, and of course you do not get Gandhi more so often, but Nehru is pervading through the pages. So you get very scintillating analysis of these people also, right? Simultaneously it's becoming a treatise on all these political figures. So how do you look at those array of figures coming, maybe in comparison with this person?
I really wasn't comparing, but what does come across, again, very complex professional and personal relationships. You mentioned Nehru. I think that's deeply representative of the kind of scale of those relationships. So just to give you context, Nehru meets Panikkar in the early 1920s, when Panikkar is essentially being sent as Gandhi's emissary to Amritsar, where there's a brewing sort of conflict happening with the Akali movement, which is essentially centered around the fact that Gurudwaras at the time were being managed or mismanaged by corrupt priests. So you had a movement underway to break the Gurudwaras out of the control of these corrupt priests. The Congress didn't have any political or ideological presence there. Gandhi had just come out of jail. This was 1924. Panikkar is chosen as the somewhat unlikely emissary, right? He's a Malayali. He cannot speak Hindustani or Hindi or any reference in Punjabi. And he's being sent to Amritsar essentially to be the Congress PR person, to sort of set up Congress ties in the state. Panikkar does this. This is a very long story. I'm just obviously cutting it very short. But Panikkar does this with great success. But Panikkar in the early 1920s is also a remarkably ambitious young man. He is looking to have a political career. He does not know how to get it. Being Gandhi's emissary at this juncture is a make or break point in his career. So for him, he feels, okay, if I can pull this off, then I can come into the full notice of Gandhi and Nehru. And maybe then that'll open up a way into some kind of open political career. It's remarkable because the sway to the archives actually tells you a lot. Nehru has heard of Panikkar by this point. He's very interested in Panikkar's mind. He's read Panikkar's writings. And Panikkar has been writing since 1914, since he was in college. And he was writing the kind of stuff as a first-year university student that, I wouldn't dream of writing at my own age. But, Nehru's read Panikkar. He respects Panikkar's minds. He's like, okay, this seems to be the right guy to send. And maybe after, if he's done a good job, we can keep him on as Congress spokesperson. Maybe he can write for us, and maybe he can write for the party. That's not what Panikkar wants at all. So you have these series of increasingly frustrated letters in the archives from Nehru to Panikkar saying, okay, Amritsar seems to have been resolved satisfactorily. Where are you? What is happening? There's no response from Panikkar. So essentially, Panikkar has left Nehru completely hanging. And you'd think this would put up Nehru's back. It actually doesn't. Right? Because Nehru at this point is General Secretary of the Congress Party. He is not somebody to be taken lightly. And yet here is a man who is just not responding to him at all. And a while later, you hear of Panikkar setting up the Hindustan Times, which was the next move in his career. It didn't go very successfully. Panikkar was not editor of Hindustan Times for long. But, Nehru and Panikkar then begin this relationship, as you said, of intellectual equals, which lasted for the length and breadth of the independence movement, right through the time when both of them died. Theirs was a professional relationship that was marked with considerable dispute as well. Panikkar's actions in China did not go down well with Nehru. Nehru was incredibly frustrated. Nehru was very angry. But you still see Panikkar being a member of the States Reorganization Commission. He was still sent to Egypt as ambassador. He was still sent to France as ambassador. He continues to hold a very important place in public life. And this is despite the fact that Nehru is constantly also irritated by Panikkar at this point. In the 1950s, you have Panikkar making some very absolute comments on language, for instance. All through his life, Panikkar has held to the fact that he does not believe in a single national language. In 1955, he tells this university campus in Kerala that Hindi is the national language. That's really not what Nehru wants to hear at all, right? And Nehru is now being questioned by international journalists saying, okay, you have a public servant who has also been an ambassador saying these things. What is your view? And Nehru says to him, look, he's taken aback completely. And he says, okay, look, there are people in this country who have views that are different from mine, and they are free to have those views. So there was a certain civility of public discourse. There was a certain intellectual engagement despite very serious disagreements on matters of politics, on matters of language, on matters of foreign policy, that defined their relationship. It was not an easy relationship, but it was grounded on utmost respect. I think, I was writing this across the 2020s, and it just brought home to me the fact that that's something that we've forgotten how to do. In this day and age, it's very easy to cancel somebody, or it's very easy to, categorize them as one binary versus the other. That was a time when, A, it was very ideologically and politically fluid, and B, there was a lot of respect for different opinions. So that really stood out to me in Nehru's relationship with K M Panikkar.
With his, intellectual civility, especially during the days of Nehru, right? It's very popular. I am reminded of an episode between Nehru and Pothan Joseph, right? He was one of the founders of most of the English newspapers. So one day, Nehru, the Prime Minister, wanted this man to meet him at the office. Then Pothan Joseph was bold enough to say, if you want the Prime Minister to meet Pothan Joseph, you have to come and meet me at my office. So that was the kind of intellectual engagement, intellectual civility, which is not really, fashionable these days. That's very, very interesting. And to move on, we often equate this person's role very interestingly with the integration of princely states and the reorganization of the states in India. He was very pivotal in those things. But my simple question is that, often we, in our imagination, we have very, very romantic, very far-fetched imagination on, princes, who they are very notorious for their garrulous, fantastic and scintillating appearance and ideas. But she also says that they are equally interesting, they are equally engaging intellectually. So how do you look at these, binary positions on princes? They are simultaneously garrulous, but equally intellectually exciting and engaging. Of course, there are some bizarre, very, very, unbelievable kind of things from their side. You wrote on those things also. So would you like to reflect on that also?
No, definitely. I think that was a bit of a learning experience for me as well. So my first biography, as I said, was on VP Menon, who sort of did the tail end, so to speak, of integration, the actual act of bringing the princely states on board. What I didn't know and what I discovered while I was researching K M Panikkar was how fundamental K M Panikkar had been in the constitutional and legal side of things. And his work was really cut out for him. So he begins this process in the mid 1920s, going into the 1930s, and he spends all that time trying to get the princes on board a united sort of map of India, which he bases on federalism. This is incredibly difficult because, as you point out, it's very easy to caricature the princes. It's very easy to dismiss them as complete cartoons. Many of them did nothing to assist their cause. The Maharaja of Patiala was known much more for his sex life than he was known for his actual mind. You have the Maharaja of Alwar, who set his polo pony on fire because it didn't perform according to what he wanted. So when you have princes like this, it does nothing to aid the fact that there were actual princes among all of this motley lot. And we've all heard of the eccentricities of the Nizam of Hyderabad, for instance. So it did nothing to help their cause that there were princes among all of these guys who actually did have a mind of their own. They were very intelligent. They had their own opinions of where they wanted to be as far as the British Crown was concerned and as far as their own rights were concerned. Where all of them were unitedly very cagey was what it meant to be part of a federation. How much of their rights would they have to give away? How much of their privileges would they have to give away? Did that mean, because all of them had built their reputations on lineages that some of them traced back to the sun and the moon practically, right? So for them, it was not just a whole new world, but it was also a world that they couldn't fathom at that point. So when you read K M Panikkar's efforts in that direction, it's, you can almost feel his frustration. Right through the 1920s and 30s, he can see that there are popular movements rising within the states. There is a move towards constitutional reform. The question is constantly being asked by political parties in India, where is India going? At what point is the Raj going to grant us independence? Right? So the question then becomes, how do you bring all these egos together? And this is why I say history is made up of so many egos. All these princes had egos. All these princes had their own tantrums. All these princes simultaneously had their own different models to present. And they disagreed with each other almost raucously. So there was no unanimous voice to get all of these guys into one room and tried to get one single unanimous consensus out of them. That marked Panikkar's time from the 1920s and 30s. And as the world heads towards the Second World War, towards the end of the 1930s, you see a Panikkar who is incredibly disillusioned. You see a Panikkar who is really unable to comprehend what these guys are doing. He's very bitter, he's very frustrated. It's at this point also, very interestingly, that he begins to feel, and this is, again, this was very surprising for me because it's in 1941. India is still in the thick of the Second World War. All the major discussions that we still have to have, whether it's the Cripps mission, whether it's the Simla conference, whether it's the cabinet mission, none of that has happened yet. And yet Panikkar is writing to his friend Saeed Mahmood from his Aligarh days, saying that, okay, I think I should consider myself a Pakistanist. It's a letter that's written, read by itself, it sounds incredibly sensational. But when you read Panikkar's life all through the 20s and 30s, when you read of his constant frustrated attempts to get the princes to realize that they have to come on board a united model of India, you begin to understand that this letter was actually written in deep disillusionment, in deep despair. There's a sense of bitterness about Panikkar at this point. I think he acknowledges the reality, the tragic inevitability. And this is very different from saying that he was in support of partition, because he was not. But he realizes that this is inevitable and he's incredibly bitter about it. He spends the 1940s, in the years leading to transfer of power, trying to convince, and he's working with Bikaner at the time. And he spends those years trying to convince the princes that, you cannot look away from the fact that popular movements in your own states are asking you to reconsider who you are and reconsider where you're going. He even tells Alan Campbell Johnson, who's Mountbatten's press attaché, that he sort of considers India and Pakistan to be the body and ears of an elephant. And he says India is the body and Pakistan are the ears. And he says India can do without, the elephant can do without its ears. So he's making all of these statements. They are incredibly disillusioned statements at this point. But it was interesting to me as somebody who's already done a biography of VP Menon to realize that, okay, the process of integration, which we tend to see as 1947 to 1951, actually starts albeit in a more constitutional legal way, in the mid 1920s and throughout the 1930s. So it was not a minute by minute immediate sort of integration. It was a process that had been started many years ago.
Okay, with that, we are, stopping this conversation here. Now the conversation is open to you. Now this is your turn. You'll be asking questions. Please.
Hello. First of all, I'm not here to ask you questions about
Yes.
the connection of what I'm to say, Sardar K M Panikkar. But as she said at the outset, that Sardar K M Panikkar is known to Kerala in parts only. That is absolutely true and 100% is right, and I agree with you. Apart from that, I am to ask you one clarification that what about the relation between VP Menon, your great grandfather, and Sardar K M Panikkar? Of course, that is not quite, you have not explained so far, I feel here. Then, one thing that I should also add here is, of course, I am not at all asking any questions, of course. Just I am making some annexure about the conversation. That he was the first founding father of Kerala Sahitya Academy. Whether that fact is mentioned in your book, I don't know.
Yeah, it is. But it would be good if you picked up a...
But at the second session, he couldn't. Because while the ministry changed, the ruling regime changed. As a result of that, he was not given the extension for his period. Because he was in the mission to form one Malayalam encyclopedia.
Yeah.
But of course, he couldn't, settle the mission because he had to go back. So these are all the things that I just want to share with you.
Yeah. Thank you.
He's Dilip Menon, a very popular historian.
Thank you very much for your first book on VP Menon, which was superb.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to reading the second book as well. See, one of the things about K M Panikkar is that he's seen largely as a Malayali who occupied the Indian stage, right? But looking at him as a historian, apart from Malabar and the Portuguese and Malabar and the Dutch and the wonderful novel Parashiraja, he also writes Asia and Western dominance. He also writes about Afro-Asia. So there's something about him being the precursor of much of what we now know as post-colonial scholarship. So he stands at the head of much of the history writing, which actually thinks about what does it mean to write history from the global south, from the colonized world. And I wondered whether you engage with some of this in your book, because historians have not paid much attention to this for surprising reasons.
No, I hope my book rectifies that, because I feel like you can't write a biography of K M Panikkar without engaging with his intellectual output, right? And all the books that you've mentioned, which he's written at various points in his public career, and it's set against not just a changing India, but a changing world. I think they were regarded as seminal in their day. Asia and Western dominance was heavily criticized, of course. But I've obviously engaged with them and I've put out that output because I think, one of the things that I think, and I hate speaking for my subjects, but just based on following Panikkar's trajectory and his intellectual career, I think he really did identify as somebody who was a constant scholar, This was somebody who constantly kept asking what it meant to not just be Indian, but also where India was going in a changing world. And I think you can't only read one book of K M Panikkar just by itself. It has to be read alongside his entire trajectory, which is huge anyway. But it gives you a great perspective and almost a ringside view into where India was going, how the past can inform our present and our future. And I think definitely that's something that I really hadn't grasped until I began researching and sort of putting this biography together. But I hope if you pick it up, I hope it meets with your expectations.
I'm sure it will.
Thank you, sir. That was an interesting question. So, please, yeah.
Sardar Panikkar was the ambassador when Chinese were swallowing Tibet. So what advice he gave? What was his attitude to Chinese? And what advice he gave to the Nehru?
What was? Sorry, sir, the second part?
What was his attitude of the Chinese invading Tibet? And what was the advice he has given to Nehru?
Okay. So that's a slightly long answer. I will give it to you in a condensed form. I think when we're looking at Panikkar's time in China, he's often been seen as the person who messed China up for us. I think there's several things that we forget. One is that we did not have a fleet of career diplomats at that point. Panikkar was not a career diplomat. Panikkar was somebody whom Nehru trusted intellectually. And at that point, Nehru was sending men and women whose mind he trusted to important postings, whether it was Moscow or whether it was Washington. Panikkar was sent to both nationalist China and the People's Republic of China. Panikkar also shared Nehru's vision of Asian solidarity, that India and China would somehow be partners in a developing world. So he gets sent to China when it's sort of the end of the Civil War, the end of the nationalist regime in China. He is then sent back to the People's Republic of China. It's when he is ambassador to the People's Republic of China that he makes grave strategic errors, including ones in perception, right? And the ones in perception has led to him being known as a communist later. He was not a communist, and I think that's important to sort of make that distinction. He was, however, definitely very swept away by communist leadership. If you read his memoir on his time in China, he's referred to them in almost absurd terms, right? So he's referred to Mao as this kind of new age Moses who lead his people to a new land. And he's referred to Zhou Enlai's fingers as being tender green onion shoots. These are not remarks that you would expect a sitting ambassador to be writing. So he was definitely swept away by communist leadership. He definitely also made grave errors of assumption. As an ambassador, you cannot assume that Zhou Enlai knows what the border is, and so you leave it out of negotiations or discussions. That's not what you have. That's not your training. But he was not a career diplomat, and he went purely on perception. And in so doing, he made an error that haunted his public career and bilateral relations for the rest of his life, really speaking. So definitely, yes, there were errors that were made. But also, we must also not forget that this was an era of Cold War. This was an era of decolonization. The United States was involved. Nehru himself had the choice to not send Panikkar back to the People's Republic of China, but Nehru did. There was also Ministry of External Affairs colleagues who really didn't like Panikkar at all and kept telling Nehru, stop it. What are you doing listening to somebody who's sending you back blatant misinformation at this point? Nehru persists and keeps Panikkar there. So as the years have passed, and this is why I say national memory is sometimes fickle, history gets rewritten and relayered in such a way that, you know, the weight of history is pinned onto one man. That's rarely ever the case.
So I think any more questions? Yeah, please, sir, please.
So you just mentioned that Mr. Panikkar was not a communist. But somewhere I was reading, or maybe it was an Instagram reel, people say that he was a Hindu nationalist, not as we understand it today, but from more of a civilizational
Correct.
ethos. Could you share your thoughts on that?
No, correct. I fully agree, and I've written about that in my book. I think in 2025, it's very easy to forget that binary didn't exist in Panikkar's day. But definitely, he was a very traditional conservative Hindu nationalist without stepping over into being a more militant supremacist at all. His idea of Hinduism was that it was at the core of India's cultural and civilizational ethos, but it was an inclusive Hinduism. It did not exclude communities, religions, anything like that. It was not a monolith. It was always, his idea of nationalism per se was always a heterogeneous one. It was never an exclusive one. So absolutely, correct.
Yeah, the last question, which I think I should be asking, he was very brilliant and he was very cunning, right? Even when Nehru was leading the day, he was, asking for meaningful engagement with, Israel also. I think along with what he was saying, I think, that the atmosphere was not conducive for that. But even then, he was asking the leaders to engage with lesser leaders, don't go after Nehrus and such people, go for smaller leaders and think of doing some programs in various universities. So how do you look at that? He was, along with the idea of having a larger Hindu culturist argumentation, of course, not exclusive in that sense, but the idea of engaging with Israel at that time when the total political climate was not for that. He was very, far-sighted or very cunning. I don't know that.
No, I mean, that's one area definitely that I genuinely, writing again through the 2020s, especially 2024, 25, really, I did not personally understand it. But again, that's not my job to bring to this narrative. But yes, Panikkar was a very ardent Zionist. It was not, and that's something that stays very constant throughout his political and public life. He begins being a supporter of Zionism in the 1920s when he is in Europe and he meets Chaim Weizmann, who was a prominent Zionist leader at that point. And that is something that he continues sort of working for behind the scenes. And this is despite the Balfour Declaration. This is despite public Indian support for the state of Palestine. He continues working actively with the Jewish Agency all through his public life, right after we've achieved independence, right after the state of Israel has been recognized. It's something that remains both very constant and something that he clearly knows would not be seen well by the establishment. So he keeps it very much under wraps. So any discussions that he has with the Jewish Agency are all very back channel talks, very secret talks, but they are there nonetheless. So yeah.
Okay, then I think that is the end of the session. We have, I think, a few more minutes. I think any more question left, you can please proceed with that. Otherwise, we'll be calling it a day. So, she actually didn't say anything personal about her, though she's not a Malayali, right? She's not a Malayali.
Yeah.
Her mother is a Malayali and her father is a Bengali, but she took serious pains to write about two towering Malayalis of the nation. So thank you very, very much for that kind consideration. Actually, we should have been doing that. As Malayalis, we are typically lazy and all. We are not writing anything about these kind of things. So we always have a special fascination for Bengali people. They are always very intellectually exacting. So thank you very much. Thank you also very much for your phenomenal scholarship. You have done an enormous amount of research. And that is exactly visible in this book, huge, thick, and monumental. I would request you to buy this book by paying your hard-earned money, and you are going to have a totally new life afterwards. I would describe myself Shiyas before reading this book and Shiyas after reading this book. And I will end with this one interesting episode. It's a very commonsensical, which I shared Narayani also. When, this Panikkar is so special kind of a person. When the situation is so complex, when there is heavy stress, he will go start writing a novel, right? When the situation is so complex, he'll go for a very serious academic enterprise. So during the very complex times in China, he divides his day into 3 segments. In the morning, he'll be working on a Chinese book. In the afternoon, he'll be working on a book on Indian freedom struggle. In the night, he'll be translating a classic into Malayalam, right? What a terrific Malayali, right? I simply felt proud of being a Malayali myself, because after reading this such a wonderful and exacting and terrific life with the pen of Narayani Basu. Thank you very much. We look forward to more interesting book from your side. Thank you very
so
much.
And
Thank you very
for
much.
stopping by. Thank you.